Hello, and thank you for joining us for another panel as part of our conference. We're thinking about family law expansively as part of this conference, and that's why we're doing a panel about members of our families getting accurate identity documents. And one sort of big development this year has been some breakthroughs on New York State Department of Health birth certificate policies. So we've put together a really collection of rock star panelists this morning that have been involved in some of these breakthroughs. And I'm going to start by introducing the excellent moderator we have for today's panel. Tanya Asapansa-Johnson Walker is a LGBT human rights advocate, a U.S. Army combat engineer veteran. She attended Staten Island College and is the co-founder of New York Transgender Advocacy Group. And they are co-chair of Equality New York, the statewide advocacy organization working to advance equality and justice for LGBTQI New Yorkers and their families. Tanya, take us away.
Hello, everyone. First, I would like to start introducing folks. Good morning. First, I would like to introduce Omar Gonzalez-Pagan. He is a senior attorney and the healthcare strategist at Lambda Legal with a long history of advancing progressive change to various jurisdictions, identity document policies through impact litigation. Milo Primeaux. They is a queer transgender person. They is CEO of Just Roots Consulting, LLC, LGBTQ plus civil rights attorney in upstate New York, an Icelandic sheep farmer, a member of the Richard C. Failla LGBTQ Commission. Charlie Arrowood is them, is an attorney licensed in New York State. They primarily provide transition-related legal services to transgender clients, including name and gender marker change, assistance, and guidance regarding health insurance coverage and employment matters. In addition to their private practice, Charlie is Name Change Project Counsel at the Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund. So we'll start off with our first question for our panelists. Welcome, panelists. Welcome, everyone. Okay. Why do birth certificate policies matter to you? And describe, I want to know about the birth certificate policy in New York State before this year, if you can. Explain the strange situation that New York City and the rest of New York State can do different with their policies. Who wants to be first?
I'll chime in there. New York City and New York State issue separate birth certificates. New York State has its own Department of Health, and then New York City has its Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. And for a while, they had different standards for changing your birth certificate. So New York City, a couple years ago, passed a bill allowing the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene to change the gender marker on birth certificates without a doctor's letter. So generally in New York State, and at the federal level, documents are changed, the gender marker on documents gets changed through a doctor's letter that says you've had quote unquote appropriate clinical treatment. That doesn't mean anything in particular. It could mean that you came out to your doctor. It could mean you had hormone treatment, you had surgery, whatever it is, doesn't really matter. It's really just a gatekeeping mechanism that puts an extra step in between you and being able to get the document that you need. And it doesn't even have to be from a doctor that treated you for anything transition related. As long as that doctor is comfortable saying this person's trans, change their document, then the government agency will do it. And so for a while, New York City required that and New York State required that to change a birth certificate. Then a couple of years ago, when that bill passed, it became a little bit easier in New York City because you could just sign an affidavit as the applicant saying, my gender is incorrect on my birth certificate, I would like to change it, and they would change it. And they also allowed for X gender markers. So we'll do a little bit of vocabulary here quickly at the beginning. You'll hear us use a few words throughout. So I just want to make sure everyone's on the same page. A transgender person is someone whose gender identity does not match what they were assigned at birth. So the sex that they were assigned at birth. A transgender man is a man who is assigned female at birth. A transgender woman is a woman who's assigned male at birth. And a non-binary person is someone who's whatever they were assigned at birth, their gender identity doesn't really fit squarely in the male or female category. So maybe they feel like they're somewhere in the middle. Maybe they feel like gender just doesn't really resonate with them. It's going to be different for everyone. And so when we talk about X gender markers, in theory, anyone could really get an X gender marker, whether it's for privacy reasons or other, so whatever reason the case may be. But most of the time, the folks who are interested in X gender markers are non-binary people, I would venture to say. And because, when you sign a document swearing to the truth of what you're saying, and they're asking you to say, I swear I am male or I swear I am female, and you are not either of those things, that puts you, and in the case when you need a doctor's letter, your doctor as well, in a position where you're effectively committing perjury. And so having another option on documents is super important to avoid that, in addition to a bunch of other things that we'll talk about. But the bottom line is New York City had this policy put in place a couple years ago where you could use an affidavit signed by yourself in front of a notary, and you could access X gender markers on your birth certificate, or if you were not comfortable with an M or an F. And then through a lawsuit that Omar worked on, which we'll also get into, New York State also began allowing this. Actually, Milo, was that, you were X? That was Milo. I apologize. So New York State also now allows for X gender markers and allows for self-attestation. So it's that affidavit. I will let others chime in now that I've...
I have a little bit to add. So I really appreciate Charlie making sure we're all on the same page with language, and for that amazing overview. That's the best recap ever. But yeah, it's, when we think, to answer Tanya's first question, why are policies around birth certificates important? Why are birth certificates important? I think for the average non-transgender person, or cisgender people who are not trans.
That was the word I forgot.
Yeah, it's a good word. For the average non-transgender person, birth certificates don't really make too much of a difference, right? You get this document when you're born, it has your name, it has your date of birth, your time of birth, your place of birth, and your gender marker, the sex assigned at birth, and somebody's squiggled signature. And every now and then you're going to pull that out for a variety of things, for school records, for medical records, maybe when you're applying for other government issued IDs, maybe for certain jobs. Certainly when you apply for a passport in the United States, you need a birth certificate, right? But generally these are things that, get packed away, get lost. People don't use them all that often. And we don't think about it, but for trans people, for non-binary people, it's a vital record. It is a government issued ID and record that validates who it is that we are in our date of birth. And for a trans person who, depending on the state they were born and depending on where they live currently, may or may not have access to other accurate government issued IDs as a result of inaccurate birth certificates, right? So I think for at least, half, if more than half of the states in the union still, or about half, maybe Omar, you could say for sure, have some pretty archaic rules and statutes on the books about changing birth certificates. Just to put New York in context, I was born in Texas, and in Texas, you cannot change your birth certificate to reflect your accurate gender marker unless you have a court-ordered sex change, which means you have to get a judge to say that you have sufficiently changed your sex enough to justify modifying a historical document. And in the eyes of the courts in these states, Texas being one of many that have this kind of statute in place, what they're really looking for is some proof of sex reassignment surgery, or sex change as they might call it, which is essentially proof that you are often that you are sterilized, that you're infertile, that you can no longer reproduce, which is, from a reproductive justice standpoint, hugely problematic and a topic for a different day. But what that means is that for folks like me born in Texas, I may or may not be able to ever change my birth certificate. For folks born in states like Ohio or Tennessee, they definitely cannot. They're not allowed to change their birth certificate, right? So, so for New York to provide some options to make it so that my vital record, my proof of citizenship and my proof of date of birth is accurate, is hugely important. And then to have folks born in New York City, one part of the state, and folks born anywhere else in New York State have different experiences with how they can update their records is also hugely problematic. So a big part of what we were doing as advocates was trying to level the playing field across New York so that everyone born in New York State has the same access to accurate vital records, so that they can obtain other accurate government issued ID, regardless of where they were born in the state. And that's really a very big deal.
And people may not realize, but we continue to be in a position now where, great, now we can get accurate birth certificates. And you can get a birth certificate with an X, whether you were born in New York City or New York State, but you can't get a driver's license with an X. So you're still in a situation where none of your stuff matches. You can't get a federal document with an X. We'll talk about some of the cases that are winding their way through the courts. But the birth certificate is now in New York still one of the only documents that you can do that on.
Yeah, and just to add a little bit both to context and the great overview of why this matters that Charlie and Milo have provided, we need to think of birth certificates, and I will differ a little bit from Milo's description that for the average non-transgender person, a cisgender person, the birth certificate doesn't matter. It matters. You use it a lot. You just don't think about it. It doesn't bother you. It's not a source of stress because it is accurate for you. But it is the foundational identity document. It's the first document you get when you're born. It's a document that follows you when you're enrolling in school as a kid. It's a document that you use as proof of identity when you get your other first state ID, whether a learner's permit, a driver's license, a passport, whatever it may be. It is proof of citizenship that you were born in the United States. It is the document that follows you from cradle to grave. It is the document that will also be the foundation by which a death certificate is drafted. And so really it is a key identity document that follows you throughout life, and that for transgender people and non-binary people is inaccurate. It doesn't represent who they are. And when you think about an identity document, it has to ultimately be reflective of the identity of the person that holds it. And when those documents do not do that, not only do they fundamentally fail to further their purpose, but they also expose people to harm. So we're talking not only of the exposure to harm because you're getting a governmental message that we don't recognize you as who you are, and that itself is detrimental to mental health, exacerbates a person's gender dysphoria, and has many other harms just from having and possessing that incorrect, inaccurate document. But it also exposes people to harm. We know that statistically and disproportionately, transgender people suffer alarming rates of violence and discrimination throughout the entire country. Just yesterday, a trans woman in Puerto Rico was stabbed multiple times by multiple individuals, and as a hate crime. And so we know there are alarming rates of discrimination towards trans people, and particularly trans women of color, and that whenever they have to present a document that discloses and outs them as transgender because the gender marker on the identity document doesn't reflect their gender expression or their identity, that outs them and exposes them to that harassment and discrimination that is so pervasive. So there are real life consequences beyond the abstract academic purposes of why it is necessary for a person to have an accurate birth certificate. And some of the framing that we've done in the work that in the cases that we've brought, is noting that all vital statistics laws in all of the states allow for the correction of errors on birth certificates. All of them do, including New York State's. And when a document has a gender marker that is not reflective of a person's gender identity, they are fundamentally incorrect. They do not reflect that person's sex as understood in science, and they do not reflect that person's sex as they understand it to be themselves. And so New York, understanding that, administratively in 2015 started permitting people to correct, New York State started permitting people to correct the gender marker on birth certificates, but they did so with third-party affirmations, as Charlie noted, from a doctor. And they did so not permitting minors to do it, only adults. And so you had a law in New York that maybe in 2015 was a little bit ahead of the time, but come 2020 actually fell behind the times and was not the modern standard. And so New York City, being a jurisdiction that had its own authority to issue birth certificates, was further ahead than the state. And so you had already also the weird situation where trans people could have consistent identity documents. And let me just actually specify there, transgender New Yorkers could have consistent identity documents or inconsistent identity documents, but it varied whether you were born in New York City or you were born outside. And so that in itself, getting New York State to get to even catch up to where New York City was an imperative just from a consistency standpoint within the state.
Well, and on the same page as the consistency thing, like when you don't allow people to make these updates, you are fundamentally preventing those documents from doing their job. It does not do the Department of Health any good to have completely inaccurate documents. You know, whatever they're trying to track with these documents can't be tracked if it's not accurate. If you get a court order for your name change and it says you shall go by this name and no other name, and you're not able to change your birth certificate, you know, you're using information that you're not supposed to be using anymore. And the name change has always been a little bit different than the gender marker change, because once you have that court order, that's one thing. But in the case of trans parents, New York State, until about, I think it happened in like May or June, I don't remember exactly, but New York State did not allow trans parents to change their own name on their child's birth certificate unless they got a separate court order on top of their name change order. So the name change order says you shall go by this name and no other name. The New York State Department of Health was not allowing that order to be used to change a parent's name on a child's birth certificate. So you were in a situation where, you know, I actually I was going to sue. I was going to file an Article 78 against the Department of Health because of this, because my kids were born before my name change and I had to register them for school. And I made several applications to the Department of Health to get this change made, so that I didn't have to out myself to the registrar every time I had to register my kid for school. And they kept denying it. And they said, you need this separate court order. So you're in a situation where trans people are required to spend the extra money of getting an additional court order. But also, why is that name change order sufficient to change? If I was born in New York State, why is it sufficient to change my birth certificate, but not my information on my child's? And so there's like just a lot of inconsistency with all of these identity document policies that comes from the people on the ground not being the ones who make the rules. The people who make the rules don't really see how it works in practice. And, you know, they're starting to listen to advocates who are like, this doesn't make any sense. But there's still a lot of work to do on a lot of different types of documents. Luckily on birth certificates, we're like kind of there. There's still this parental information thing that they came up with. They're still requiring if the person if the person whose birth certificate it is now over 18 or over 17, everyone on the birth certificate needs to consent to the name change of one of the parents. So if I'm 18 years old and my parent transitions and gets a name change, and they want to apply to change their name on my birth certificate, I need to sign, they need to sign, and the other parent on my birth certificate needs to sign, which is not feasible for a lot of people who maybe they don't speak to the other person on the birth certificate. Maybe it's a safety risk, whatever it is, you know, that's a ridiculous extra imposition that other people do not have to deal with.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. That was wonderful. You know, I transitioned in I transitioned in 1989. I couldn't get my name changed until like 2007. And my gender marker was changed in what, 2016 or something like that? Or, you know, so, you know, and it's really complicated, and there's a lot of violence behind not having your documents match your identity. And I'm having problems on a federal level, but that's it for another, I guess that's for another panel, where I had Junior in my name, and I went to have it changed at the Social Security office, and they kept the Junior on my name. So that's on my Social Security card. That's in my documents, and when people call me from the Social Security office, they usually say Tanya Asapansa-Johnson Walker Jr. So there's Junior on the end of my name. It was in my former name, and they kept it in there as to be mean and to discriminate. But anyway, we'll move on to the next. We'll move on to the next question, and this question is for Omar. I would like for Omar to talk more about that lawsuit with the New York State Department of Health that finally allows youth to change the gender markers and all ages to make these changes without a medical affidavit. Take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Tanya. And you're 100% right, right? Like there's only so many changes where positive changes that we've achieved, but certainly how they're implemented too matters, and how it affects people's lives. So earlier this year, we sued the New York State Department of Health and New York State over its 2015 policy, which required that third-party affirmation, but prohibited minors from, in any circumstance, correcting the gender marker on the birth certificates. Didn't even matter if they had parental support, right? And so we represented a MHW, a trans boy who lived in Texas, in Houston, who could have gotten a birth certificate corrected for a court order because they went through all of the things that they needed to do in Texas, but were absolutely prohibited from correcting the birth certificate in New York. And MHW was born in Ithaca, so it also did this juxtaposition of being born in one of the little progressive liberal enclaves of the Northeast, that is Ithaca, New York, living in the reddest of states in Texas, and being able to do something in Texas that you were not able to do in New York. And so that illustrated in you know, we spoke with Milo, for example, who had dealt and heard from many families that were going through this too. But it illustrated why it was so important to get this corrected. And I'll let Milo and Charlie speak to this, but there had been many attempts to get this corrected through advocacy with the New York State government and direct advocacy with the governor's office and the Department of Health, unfortunately to no avail. And And there was a pending bill, the Gender Recognition Act, that just didn't see traction sufficiently, unfortunately, in the legislature. And at some point, it's enough is enough. If the advocacy and the waiting is not getting the result, then we needed to go to court. And we knew that we had the law on our side. We've brought these cases before where we had already eradicated the categorical prohibitions on correcting birth certificates, the sex designation on birth certificates in Puerto Rico, in Idaho, and in Kansas. So prior to 2018, only 5 states absolutely, completely, under any circumstance, prohibited those corrections. Kansas, Idaho, Puerto Rico were 3 of those jurisdictions, and the 2 others were Ohio and Tennessee. We've won 3 of those, and the other 2 cases are pending. So we needed to do this, and we filed this lawsuit. And lo and behold, with the support of Attorney General James and her leadership, the wheels of bureaucracy got greased and moved pretty quickly. And so in response to the filing of our lawsuit, the Department of Health modified their policy and frankly made it one of the most progressive in the country, which Milo can now speak also to, like how it even became even more progressive in June later this year. But in March of 2020, we jointly announced, as a result of the lawsuit, that not only would New York State now permit minors to correct their birth certificate, the gender marker on their birth certificate, and granted it does require parental consent in some circumstances, but if by allowing that, they also brought New York to the fore and decided to eliminate the need for any third-party verification. And that was a huge change that just didn't apply to minors, but also writ large to every trans and non-binary person, as we'll learn later in the state of New York. So that was a big shift, and it also illustrates how impact litigation, just bringing the case, can be can spark the fire that is needed to motivate the changes that are necessary, that can be done administratively. So, we didn't need to litigate this to the end. The filing of the lawsuit was sufficient for us to spark that change that was necessary.
I also want to just add in, it wasn't only that you needed the third-party attestation from the doctor, that for the birth certificate, that doctor's letter needed to be notarized. So it's the only circumstance in New York where a doctor's signature was not sufficiently inherently notarized. Usually when a doctor signs something, they're swearing to it under penalty of perjury, and it counts as like when an attorney signs something, you're swearing to it. But for a trans person to change their birth certificate, the doctor then had to go out of their way to find a notary and have them notarize their signature. So I found myself traveling all over Long Island to various doctor's offices, notarizing people's birth certificate letters. I used to, when I went into my endocrinologist for my appointments, he would have a stack of letters sitting on his desk waiting for me to come in, and I would bring my stamp and I'd just stamp all his letters while I was in there. So that's another, like, there was no reason that should have been different for trans people. The excuse that the Department of Health gave us every time we asked was that they were concerned that trans people would forge their doctor's signatures. Well, then don't require a doctor's letter. Just ask me to sign a document that says that I am who I am. So that's like a super frustrating thing that existed, but doesn't anymore. So thank you everyone who worked on that.
Yes, I kind of have a question as well. What are some of the first steps a young person would or youth would have to do to begin to change their gender marker? Without the medical affidavit, what are some of the first steps? What would they need to do first to begin to change it?
At this point, you just have to print out the documents and find a notary, get both your parents on board, and you just sign the forms and mail them in.
Oh, that's great.
Yep. Omar, you want to
Thank
try?
you.
Yeah, I was going to say, ideally, you want to, it is something that you want, for different people, this happens at different stages in their life, but you want to have a certainty of your identity and make sure that but once that certainty, and you could be young, really young when that happens, but when that certainty is there, if you have the parental support, you then can correct it as a minor. Unfortunately, it does require a parental signature. In fact, it requires both parental signatures unless the second parent is not on the picture. So that's still, we know that the reality on the ground is different, and that parental support is not always there, let alone both parental supports when there's divided families. And so that is still those obstacles and barriers that make it more difficult for people that need to be addressed in the future. But where we are now compared to where we were 9 months ago, it's diametrically different.
And I would also add, this is not legal advice, it's just general information. If you are in that place where you are certain, the earlier you change this stuff, the less stuff you have to change. So if you get your birth certificate changed before you get a driver's license, before you get a permit, before you apply to college, before you take the SAT, you can take all those things in your new name and with your new gender marker. And in the first instance, and you don't then have to go change your transcript, change your ID documents, change your passport, all that. So if you're in a place where you're able to make the changes and you are certain that you picked a name that you're comfortable with changing your gender marker to whatever you want to change it to, or maybe you want to keep your gender marker, whatever the case is. The earlier you do this, if you're certain and you're solid on it, the less stuff you have to then change on the other end.
Thank you. Okay. My next question is going to be directed at Milo. I need Milo to talk about the winning of the X-gender option for a client who identifies as non-binary. Tell us about that.
Thank you. So this was an issue that came up quite a bit over the years. I joined the upstate New York legal world in 2015 when I moved to Rochester to lead the LGBT rights project at Empire Justice Center, and jumped feet first into an existing coalition of amazing advocates across the state in New York City and across upstate New York who had already been doing this work for quite some time, and was glad for all the ground that they laid. And I just want to make that really clear, we're 3 people who are here, but the work has been done for a very long time by a whole lot of people. Tanya, your advocacy and leadership are included in that, right? Like the community of folks doing this work is huge. So I'm grateful for that. But when I joined in 2015, we were actively having negotiations with the Department of Health's director, the Vital Records director at the time. And I remember feeling very excited even by my first joining of the call, because it seemed pretty promising. We were like, here are the things that need to change. And the director was like, yeah, that sounds great. We are in the process of developing a policy that will address these things, and we really appreciate your input. And we expect the policy to be, addressed pretty soon. And we were like, oh, that's great, really soon. Wow, that's wonderful, That was in 2015, and then 2016 came around, and then 2017 came around, and 2018 and 2019. And every time we talked to them, they were like, oh yeah, we're working on the policy. We're like, do you know what it means to work on a policy? And soon, do you know the definition of soon? Because I feel like we're talking different languages here. So, in my practice as a civil rights attorney, working with a lot of people through name changes, I've helped well over 300 folks across New York State at this point with name changes. And I would say almost half of those folks identify as non-binary at this point and use gender-neutral pronouns and would prefer a gender-neutral marker on their identity documents if they had the choice. That's a significant number of people, and I think we're going to see more of that as time goes on. And routinely, my clients would say, okay, how do I update my birth certificate? And I'm like, oh, well, you really can't, but here's what you could do to try to move this along. If you apply to the Department of Health and get a rejection letter, a letter that actually says we are not doing it, we can appeal that, and I think we would win. And I started telling people this in 2015. Some people tried, some people didn't bother trying because they thought it would be useless. And then one person approached me earlier this year by the name of Aisha Cruz. They're a non-binary person who actually live in Massachusetts now, who back in 2018 started the process of applying for an updated birth certificate in New York State that would reflect an X gender marker. And over the course of 2018 until the very end of 2019, so 18 months later, after many phone calls, many letters, many emails with the Department of Health, they finally received a letter of rejection. We're like, finally, yes, that is what we need. And we took that letter and we filed an Article 78 against the department. Filed it on March 19th, which was either the day the courts closed or the day before the courts closed because of the pandemic. So we filed it and then we waited for the courts to reopen. And pretty much within a week of the courts reopening, I got a phone call from the New York State Attorney General saying, hey, we would very much like to take care of this because, the Department of Health has changed its policy. So this is no longer a problem. I said, oh, really? It changed its policy. That's fantastic news. When did that happen? They're like, oh, recently. And I'm like, cool. Can you send me a copy of it? And they sent me a copy of it and it was dated the very same day as the phone conversation. It's like, oh, so this is hot off the press. So like Omar described, a little bit of legal action was enough to grease the bureaucratic wheel to align what our definitions of soon and recently might mean to come up with a new policy. So as a result of just filing the Article 78, we were able to get them to update the policy. Unlike Omar's experience with Lambda in a joint resolution of a case, the Department of Health did not want to have a joint statement and did not immediately release this new policy on its website, despite my efforts to encourage them to do so, which might have been my fault for not pushing harder, I'm not sure. But what that means too is that there were a period of months actually where the policy was effective and in place. There was official policy, but there was no indication on their website whatsoever about it. When media contacted the department to ask for clarification that this in fact had happened, they would give very brief answers but not provide copies of the policy. So for a period of months, I think now it's resolved, but people had no idea that they had rights to update their birth certificate to reflect their accurate gender marker. So I think this highlights at least an opportunity or a cautionary tale for future efforts with agencies and bureaucracies that, just winning the policy, winning the rights is not entirely helpful if no one knows about it. So to be sure to include that as part of a negotiation for settling any cases or dismissing any cases, because it's not helpful if people don't know. But yeah, it's official now, so that's the good news. But I do want to say I appreciate my clients' perseverance. 18 months is a really long time to fight for this, and it also points out, not a small amount of privilege in order to be able to do so. I think that all of these processes for changing your name, updating your documents, no matter what your life is like, it's a daunting process to go through, going through all these bureaucratic hoops to jump through. And for folks who are, extremely low income and have unstable and unsafe housing situations and unemployment or underemployment and are dealing with disabilities or chronic illnesses, these things become exponentially more difficult to do. And so it does tend to be folks with more privilege who can stick it out and push through these sort of barriers to get to the other side. But we have to think about those folks who are, harmed and struggling as a result of not having access to these important rights and to these important documents, who also don't have the means and the resources necessarily to put up the fight like this. And part of the work that I do is try to think about how we can make these legal efforts more accessible, affordable certainly, but accessible, and manageable for folks who are like even more at the margins than the clients that we tend to serve. So something to think about a lot.
Thank you, Milo. Thank you for the great work all of you are doing. It's just wonderful. I mean, you're actually saving lives. Do you realize that? You're actually saving lives with the work you're doing, because it's stressful, especially like if you're a child and you have a parent or both parents who are who don't understand or who are willfully ignorant to the subject of our lives. They must be going through a very hard time. And with your knowledge and expertise and the work you're doing, you're actually saving thousands of lives. There's a lot of pain, in society with people trying to get their documents, to match their identity. And the work you're doing right now is amazing. You are all amazing. And you really should pat yourself on the back. Thank you. Thank you for the great work you do. And so now I have a question for Charlie. Charlie, can you talk to us about the struggle and finally victory for trans parents making changes to their children's birth certificates? Please.
Yeah, I talked a little bit about this earlier, but basically the situation was that there was no mechanism for parents of children born in New York State to change their name on their child's birth certificate. And there was also no way for them to change their parental designation. So, for example, I was mother on my kid's birth certificate. We had mother, and I asked them to change its parent. They told me for a very long time that they're unable to print a birth certificate that says parent. But if you go through an adoption, the birth certificate that they produce says parent. So there is a piece of paper that they had a template for that said parent. And they were choosing not to allow trans parents who asked for it to have that document, or to even let trans parents change from mother to father or father to mother. This, puts you in a position where you have to out yourself whenever you have to use your kid's birth certificate. Your kid has to then have a conversation about that every time they use their birth certificate if someone knows their parents. And the reason I chose to move forward with this was because like Milo was saying, I am in a position of extreme privilege in that I do this work and I am able to have the conversations. I have signed up to have these conversations with the powers that be, with other people. And so I don't want people, a trans woman up in the middle of nowhere in New York State to have to, have this conversation with a registrar at her kid's school, or if her kid is registering for sports or whatever it is, in a place where it may be unsafe for her to have that conversation, or someone who, doesn't have the resources to, I had the assistance of a white Jew law firm, Debevoise in Plimpton, and, not everybody has the ability to connect with those resources. And so I figured I was in a position to make this change happen, even if it was not super, it was more of like a pain in the butt for me to not have this. I would have been, I did register my son for kindergarten with my old birth certificate, and I did have to have a conversation about it. And I was expecting to have to do it again with my daughter. And in fact, the change came down just just before I had to register my daughter, and I was not going to have time to get the new birth certificate. So I just registered her with her old one. And we are now a mother family in the new district that we just moved to, which fine. That's more comfortable for me than being mother and father or whatever. But they did the same thing with this situation as they did with Milo, where the policy recently changed. The memo that the form that they created was dated, again, the day before they sent the announcement to me, or the approval to me. There was a typo on the form. It was very obvious that someone just threw it together. The way it was written out on the form was very difficult to understand. It didn't make a lot of sense. And again, they did not post it for a very long time on the website. So we nudged them a little bit, and they ultimately did post it. But for a while, the only place that you could get those two new policy documents were like from me, if you happen to know me and Milo. And so I was blasting it all over social media, trying to get people aware of both of these changes, and the change in February with Omar. And, you know, it can't be that you just like happen to know the right person who has this information. That's not how these policies have to work. That's not effective. It's not fair. And there needs to be like an easily findable policy. The fact is, like, in all of these cases, advocates have been handing these agencies complete policies on a silver platter for so long. They did not have to do any work. They kept saying, we're developing a policy. Like, no, we gave you the policy. At self-attestation, here's what the form should say, and everyone should be able to do this, and there should be X's. And we've done this now for like multiple different agencies, and they have to like have all these hearings and make all this, like, it's a whole thing, and it doesn't have to be that way. And we're finding, you know, Omar, you're working on the driver's license case, and that's another one. For years, we've been working on this. So where's, you know, even the Gender Recognition Act, which we're going to talk about in a minute, has a DMV component to it. And we had a conversation about the birth certificate component and the DMV component way early on. Is it worth putting this in the bill if we can do this administratively? And everyone said, we've been trying to do it administratively for years, and they keep saying that they're doing something and nothing is happening. And they purport to all be really excited to make these changes, and totally on board, and they're almost there, and they're, you know, it's the plan, and then it just doesn't happen. So sometimes this nudging is necessary. You know, we have a lot of people on the ground doing a lot of work with all of these agencies, and it took an Article 78 from Milo, an Article 78 or a case from Lambda, the threat of an Article 78 from me, for them to actually do something. I think they just got to a point where they realized they were finally going to get sued, and they decided to move forward with things. But it didn't have to be that way. Like, we gave them an easy out very early on, and they have opted for years not to take it. So yeah, so the bottom line is now trans parents can change their kids' birth certificates with their own name change order. They should be able to change their parental designation just by filling out the form. And if anyone has any problems with that, let us know, because they shouldn't.
So, like, does anybody else want to say something? Or, okay, so right now we're gonna just have a general discussion about, you know, what does it look like for identity documents in New York? What's the landscape of identity documents? We could talk a little bit more about Omar's driver's license lawsuit, as far as you can go into it. And also what the Gender Recognition Act would do if passed in New York State, or anywhere.
Yeah, so I'll just speak briefly to the current lawsuit that we have on behalf of Sander Saba and against the DMV, New York State DMV and New York State. So we had been working for a while with Sander on this. Obviously, we participated in these conversations as Charlie and Milo have for a while now, and there's no movement from New York State, and it's complicated, right? It's what the answer that they would say in getting it done. And so we were preparing this lawsuit, pandemic hit, and lo and behold, Milo got this incredible change to occur in response to the Article 78 following the MHW on June. And so, but it wasn't widely publicized, but it was key, and it was very important because it added another layer of irrationality to the policy. You can have a birth certificate issued by the very state saying that your gender marker is X, but lo and behold, you go and get your driver's license, and you cannot have a driver's license that says that your gender marker is X, because either you are don't identify as fully female or fully male or identify in a spectrum, and it's just so absurd that you can walk in with a birth certificate from the very same state, and the driver's license won't reflect that. For Sander, it was a situation in which they had already corrected their birth certificate because they were born in New York City. So this had occurred prior to this change in June, but now the rationality didn't just extend to between the city-state inconsistency, but actually just state inconsistency in terms of policies. We filed a lawsuit. The state has requested a couple of extensions as we are in conversations, but our hope is that in response to the other cases, there will be, and this is already public from an extension request from the government, that we will be able to reach an agreement that gets this done administratively in response to the case. And so that will be obviously a big win. There are a number of other identity documents that are used throughout the state, right? It's not just your driver's license or state ID, benefits cards, many other things that people use in the state. Our hope is that in response to this, that will make it much more feasible and easier for all of those policies to be updated. But it cannot. We should keep our eye on the ball and keep track of all of those, because we don't want those inconsistencies to persist. And people shouldn't forget that we also have federal identity documents, social security cards, as Tanya mentioned earlier, passports, for example. And so it is important for all of those to be consistent. And so we have a pending case that we won at the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals that found that the denial of the U.S. Department of State to Dana Sim, our plaintiff, who is an intersex, non-binary person, that the state's denial of Dana Sim's request to have an X gender marker on their passport was arbitrary and capricious, and so the Court of Appeals, we had won it twice at the district court level, and the Court of Appeals sent the case back down to the Department of State to reach a new decision. So it's not the final decision in the case, but it does give a glimpse of even federal courts on U.S. passports, which is such a international important document, to have the prospect of having X markers and non-binary identities recognized at the federal level.
Tanya, you're muted.
Oh, so where are we with the Gender Recognition Act? It's what do you think will make it pass or help it to pass sooner? I know we're running out of time. We're out of time.
Yeah. So very quickly, the Gender Recognition Act is a bill that was introduced in the Assembly and in the Senate that does a lot of the things, or it would codify in statute a lot of the things that we've won over the past year, including ex-gender markers on state issue documents, self-attestation, gender marker changes for minors, parental designation changes and name changes, and a couple of other things. It would get rid of the publication requirement for name changes. Our sponsor in the assembly lost his primary, so we are working on finding another sponsor, and we're also thinking about what more we can ask for. So we're trying to go a little bit bigger. There are a number of other things that we want to get in there. There's the issue of marriage certificates. So if you get married prior to your name change, you can't amend your marriage certificate. You have to have another ceremony.
What?
Yeah. And they haven't really explained why. Once someone told me it's because it's a witness document, and I said, okay, so I'll get 2 more witnesses. They won't do it unless you have another ceremony. So there are a handful of other things that are going on. There are issues with name changes in the school system at the state level. Schools that just decide that they will not change a person's name on their transcript and diploma if they've already graduated. So you can't utilize your high school transcript or diploma. There are a lot of different things out there that you don't think about being an issue unless it's affecting you. So we are kind of recalibrating and taking a moment as the legislature is in kind of weird session. And then we're going to kind of regroup in the next year and hopefully get a more robust bill passed.
In other words, there was too much winning, so we need to come up with new things that we need to get.
The throttle.
It's a good problem to have.
It's true.
Thank you, everyone. I believe, is this the end? I think it's the end of this wonderful panel of excellent, the work you're doing is amazing. And you keep doing the great work, Charlie and everyone, just keep doing the great work you're doing. You're saving a lot of lives, and you're really enlightening society about our issues and the problems we're having, and making it legal for us to have our documents match our identity. And I want to thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks all for this great discussion.
Thank you for this great. Thank you.
Thanks, Tanya.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Matt.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Everybody.